Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to yet another Kepler Live conversation with another teacher. Thank you so much for following along, everybody, as we've been going through this. And today we have Mr. Clark Weidner. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Joffrey. I appreciate it.
So I'm really excited to talk about one of the classes you have coming up this fall, listed on the banner below for everyone who's viewing. Which is film and apologetics. So we're going to talk a lot about apologetics today. You're an apologist and you're involved in apologetics in a lot of different ways. We're going to talk about that. But first, I'd love for our audience to just get to know who you are. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. I graduated with my bachelor's in English. So I'm a big literature guy. I've always loved to read. Just grew up loving books. And after I graduated with that bachelor's, really wasn't sure what to do. And started having some conversations with people who disagreed with what I believed in my faith. And I realized I didn't have great answers for their questions. So, of course, I began to study apologetics, fell in love with it. And from that point on, decided this is what I want to do. I want to study further. I want to sort of learn to master apologetics. And so I started looking into different schools to attend. And Houston Baptist University was one of the schools that came up. Dr. William Lane Craig was a big influence on me when I first started studying apologetics. And he's a professor there. And there's some other professors, Dr. Holly Ordway, Michael Ward, Philip Callan. And these are people that have influenced me, Mary Jo Sharp, Nancy Piercy. And so I just knew that was a perfect fit for me. I went to the school, and since then, I'm actually graduating next month with my master's in apologetics. And I've studied more of the cultural side of apologetics, which would be more the imaginative apologetics, what C.S. Lewis does, what Francis Schaeffer did, what Tolkien's done with apologetics, where you're crafting these strong cases for God's existence, but in a story or through an imaginative appeal, versus just the strict philosophical appeal to apologetics. Since then, I launched a YouTube channel. And I started interviewing some of these people because I was surrounded with so many interesting people from HBU and just from all over the United States. And I thought, well, this is neat that I get to connect with them. I'd love to start an apologetics ministry. So launched a website. The Solid Faith is the website, thesolidfaith.com, and a YouTube channel at The Solid Faith as well, and a podcast. And so started having these apologists on, and we'll talk a little bit about that, I know, today. But yeah, since then, that's been a big heartbeat of mine, and also publishing a few articles here and there. And now I'm teaching here at Kepler, so I'm excited about the opportunity to be at Kepler.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited about not only your stuff, but there's so many things being taught at Kepler where I look at it and I think beyond just the wonderful potential for education, part of education is discipleship, and there's a lot that's being offered. I think, goodness, what an opportunity for Christian discipleship. Some of those names you mentioned are really big guns in the apologetics world. I actually. Before you said, I didn't know all those people were at HPU. That's pretty amazing that you were able to work with such folks and be mentored by such folks. And so now you have an apologetics ministry, right? Most of it online. I watched some of your videos on YouTube. Really enjoyed it, and I was actually very impressed by sort of an ancillary, like off to the side sort of thing, but. The production values are really high. I don't know if you're a one-man or two-person operation, but those production values are pretty impressive. And I actually wanted to share with people something that I think really displays those high-level production values. So there you go. For
Yeah.
whatever reason, that video really just charmed me.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
really, guys, he really does honestly have a very high production. You can see the care he's taking
Oh yeah.
in that video. But yeah,
Yeah.
the actually, what I wanted to highlight with that video is your personality.
Yeah.
You're a lot of fun online. So just take that for what it's worth. But I really have been enjoying your
Oh
content.
yeah.
So if
Yeah.
you actually want to give yourself a plug, one more time, so people can get the website, where you are available on social media, and then I'd like to talk apologetics and the student with you.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, what you see there is what goes on behind the scenes. That's what happens when you have to do a few takes to get it right. But we do work hard to make sure that the production quality is good. Actually, I grew up with a friend that videoed. I used to skateboard in high school, and so it was always him with the camera and recording everything and editing everything. And so he helps edit my podcast now and films the podcast. So it's been a good thing to have him with me. But yeah, the
Yeah.
podcast is just The Solid Faith. So THE, all the different faiths are taken up. So somebody already has solid faith. So we just took the solid faith. So THE solid faith. .com, and that's also our Instagram handle and our Facebook handle, our YouTube handle. It's all the solid faith. So that's where they can find it. And just about anywhere where there's podcasts, we're there. So most of our podcasts are downloaded from Apple or from Spotify, but I know there's some others that carry it as well. So most places where you can download podcasts, you can find Solid Faith podcasts on there as
So
well.
obviously you're passionate to do apologetics,
Hmm.
and passionate. It becomes clear in your content that you're passionate not just to be an apologist, but to make apologists.
Hmm.
So I wonder if you would define apologetics for us, and then talk about why you have this passion to make apologists.
Yeah, it's very simple. That apologetics is a defense of the faith. It's from the Greek word apologia, defense of the faith, and there's been a lot of different ways to do that or to approach that, and so all that matters to me is that I'm putting forth good reasons to believe not only in God but Christianity, to trust in the Christian worldview. And so I believe that there's just profound evidence for the Christian faith, and so I want to present that any way I can. So whether that be through a philosophical argumentation or a story as well, and one of the courses that I teach is film and apologetics, and I think there's a lot of worldviews that are displayed on the screen. And so, there's different ways to approach apologetics, but it's basically just giving a defense for the Christian faith. I think it gets confused sometimes with apologizing for something. That's not really what we mean by apologetics. So we're giving a defense. It's more of a offensive position, really. We're taking a defense for the faith, but we're also presenting something that's tangible, that's real. And so it's something that became a big passion of mine because I found that there were great answers out there. There were great philosophers out there who had been answering the most difficult, challenging questions for Christianity, all throughout history. And so that's my heartbeat. Like you said, I do want to create apologists. I do want to give people the tools that I was able to access to learn more about my faith. And so any way I can do that, I try to make that happen. So.
Yeah. So one of the things you really lean on is something that for me, I think we need to bring more into apologetics, which is apologetics through aesthetic,
Mm,
right? Which you were kind
yeah.
of talking about a little earlier today. So Chesterton, Lewis. Lately for me, I say lately, recently for me, N.D. Wilson and some
Mm,
of his works. They are essentially apologies, right?
right.
But it's from so we think about truth, beauty, and goodness. And beauty seems to be the one we always neglect. Like Christians always ask themselves, it
Mm,
seems to me like more often than not, the first thing we ask ourselves is it true?
yeah.
Even before we ask ourselves if something is good. That's the second question. And then finally, we might get around to asking if something is beautiful. But I really think that we can approach any of those things from any of the angles. So approaching truth and goodness through beauty, I think that the church needs more of that. So I really appreciate that. That's a part of your thinking.
Yeah, yeah. The apologists I think that have influenced me the most are those that captivate the imagination and that there's a great way to use art as a defense of the faith. So artists all throughout history have given us these beautiful pictures that captivate the imagination as well. And so we get that in film, we get that in poets, we get that. Malcolm Guide is a poet that I like to read that just really captivates the imaginative appeal of apologetics. And so there's great ways to recapture the imagination. I think that's one thing that's lacking today, is captivating not only the mind but the heart, captivating the imagination as well. And so it's reason is dependent upon the imagination, and we can't just reason our way to something without using our imagination as well. And so imagination is simply image making. And so it's taking something that's not there and creating an image, and really rationalizing a belief through meaning as well. So it's one thing if I just give you the logical argument, let's say the Kalam cosmological argument, which is a fancy philosophical term. If I give you the argument, but there's these great videos that William Lane Craig is making now, where he shows the Kalam cosmological argument through pictures and through imagery and through. There's something about art that brings the meaning to the table as well, and I think that apologists are catching on to that, and that's really important to bring beauty to the table as well, because I believe beauty is just a fingerprint of God's creation, and it points back to Him.
So we're going to talk about your class film in apologetics in short order, and clearly there's a connection in what everything you're saying to that. But before we do that, so the way I'm going to phrase the question, you can definitely go ahead and pick apart. So the question is, why should kids, and that might be one of the points that you go after, but why should kids study apologetics? Because you're going to be teaching apologetics to high schoolers.
Yeah, it's a great question. I believe that that as kids, we begin to develop behavior patterns and ways of thinking, or we frame the world even at a younger age than most parents may even realize. So we begin to adopt a worldview even at a young age that we may not be trained per se in how to adopt a worldview or even know what a worldview is. You begin to see the world through a certain lens. And so I think that's a crucial age to teach kids apologetics. There's been some great apologetics tools written for kids. Melissa Kane Travis, she's a professor at HBU, someone I'm connected with, and she's written some kids books that teach apologetics even at 7, 8 years old. They can begin to grasp some of these arguments for God's existence. And I think that we are in sort of a competition here with the world, because there are things that are embedded into even children's films or children's stories that are not Christian, that are maybe against the Christian worldview, that press against that. And so we need to give our children the tools to defend their faith at a young age. And then, of course, those patterns will just only grow stronger over time. So I want to teach kids even at a younger age, but junior high and high school is a crucial age where worldviews are being developed. And so I want to help in any way I can to teach apologetics to young people, because it's something I wish I would have had at a younger age. I went to college unprepared for a lot of the things that I heard in my undergraduate studies, and I think there are so many people that are in the same boat. I know Lifeway Research did a study that 75% at their study of young people walk away from the faith when they go to college. And so I think the reason for that is if we don't give them sound doctrinal teaching and theological teaching and apologetic teaching and training, then when they step into a classroom that's very secular, and as we know, most of our campuses and universities these days are pretty secular, and they're faced with these tough arguments and they don't have a response, it can be catastrophic for their faith. And so I just want to give young people the tools to defend the faith for themselves.
Yes. And, there's an aspect of that where it goes beyond simply the arguments, and the exposure itself is important. I mean, one of my hobby horses in thinking about, this loss to the church as young Christians go off to college, I've been amazed at how often young people go to a new environment such as college, and it turns out that the people they're meeting who are not believers are nice guys. Like, I have a roommate and he's an atheist and he's a nice guy.
Yeah.
And there's like no one who was educating you ever suggested that they wouldn't be, right?
Yeah.
But there's still like, where there's a tendency, if we're not being conscious about things, for many of us when we're young, to just we create these ghosts, these paper tigers, these monsters, and then we go to college, and in fact, the philosophy professor is quite friendly and accessible and
Right.
helpful, and then he has these ideas that, maybe I should consider the ideas,
Yeah.
because the guy, it turns out, is quite personable. And so even just the exposure, like talking about these things before you get into these new environments, is, I think, a crucial part of an education. Just the exposure itself.
Yeah, you raised such a great point there because a lot of my professors some of my favorite professors were atheistic in my undergraduate studies, and I became friends with them, and I was in an environment where I could talk about my faith, but I didn't have a lot of great answers when I first got to college, and I wish I would have had that training as a high school, junior high student. And so, yeah, I think you find out that you can even smuggle the truth or steal what Frank Turek calls stealing from God. You can take things that are actually only defendable if God exists and wrap it in a nice package, a secular package, and sell a bag of goods that really you can't defend. But if you don't know that as a college student, you're going to embrace it wholesale, and that can be dangerous. And so, yeah, it's a very good point that you raised.
So let's talk about your class, film and apologetics. Why aren't you teaching an introduction to apologetics, or philosophical apologetics, or just a course called apologetics? You're teaching film and
Mm.
apologetics. Why?
Yeah. I think one reason for that is film is fun. I just enjoy good films. I enjoy watching movies. I enjoy classic films, but also storytelling. I think it was Plato who said that those who tell stories rule society. And so I think it's really a powerful example in our day and age of how fast worldviews can shape the culture. If you look at the culture today, by and large, Hollywood does shape our culture for better or for worse, and most of the time for worse these days. And so, there are great films that tell some powerful stories. That again, I'm appealing to the imaginative side of apologetics, where not I'm not only just making a strong philosophical case for something, but presenting it to you in a way that has some meaning to your life or some value to your life. And so, watching these films, it's really unique to look at the philosophies that are kind of embedded in each film or the worldview in each film, and to discuss some of those things. And even you mentioned beauty. Film is beautiful. It's something that throughout history. And in this class, we start with a lot of the silent films, and you start with some grainy old films. They're considered classics, Sunrise and
That's cool.
Nosferatu, and
Huh.
you're watching these films, and you're like, man, this quality is nothing compared to all the CGI I see. But again, you're seeing that they used the tools that they had and made something that's still beautiful, and you're seeing it from different aspects of history. And they're watching is we start off in the beginning of the class watching films from the 20s and the early age of cinema, and then getting all the way up to the modern age where you see now a lot of advancement in what we have. And so, yeah, there's just a lot of things there, but the sound, the pictures, the camera angles, all these things are used to tell a story, and each little piece has a role to play. And so teaching students how to see that, and to dialogue with those films, and to dialogue with each other about the films, and to talk about what they're seeing, the worldviews that they're seeing in the films. It's a really neat way to bring apologetics to the table, versus just teaching pure apologetics. And I would be happy doing either one, but the film is really a fun course to teach.
Yeah, oh, for sure. So, I was looking at your book list, and there were. I was pleased to see that there are a couple of books here that I had read myself.
Yeah.
One of them is Johnston's Real Spirituality, Reel,
Yes.
Theology and Film and Dialogue. The other one is Brian Godawa's book. How do you say his last name?
That's how I say it too. I think Ottawa.
He is. I believe he was both producer and director of To End All Wars. Is that right?
I believe so.
And which is a great movie, and you guys should watch it. We might even talk about it here. But so his book, Hollywood Worldviews, Watching
Mm.
Films with Wisdom and Discernment, is on your list. And I wonder why you chose that book.
You know, when I started putting this class together, and I would be remiss if I didn't do this, but I had a mentor that taught film and apologetics at HBU, and that's Philip Talon. And Dr. Talon really helped me to put my course list together. He's written about films, and he's writing a book right now about horror films. He's one that is I really trusted in putting this course together. And this is just one of the books that he recommended that I go out and pull for the course. And so I've read through the book, and I think it is such a great example of how to uh, just kind of combine apologetics to watching films. He goes through things from the postmodern worldviews, romanticism, even the atheistic worldviews, Christian worldviews in films, existentialism, all these fancy philosophical terms. But he shows you how they take place in these films. And so, as I'm reading through the book, I mean, there's so many films that I've seen in the past that I didn't realize the weight of the worldview in each film. And so I think that book is just a really great, almost, I don't want to say starter book because there's so much in it. It could be read 3 or 4 times, but it's a great introduction to how we can use apologetics to learn more about film, or we're looking at the worldviews embedded in each film. And so it's sort of a overview of all these different worldviews that are in films throughout history. And then, of course, he also does a really unique thing in that he gives you specific films to watch for homework. And he'll say, do this, and here's some discussion questions. And I thought that was really neat. So anyway, I think that's a great book that it's probably my favorite on the course list out of all the books that I have on the course list. I think that may be my favorite. It's probably the most applicable that we'll be pulling from a lot in this
Mm.
course. So yeah, that's probably my favorite one.
So you mentioned that one of the effects of reading through that book was that you reconsidered the weight of the worldview behind certain film works. Uh, I wonder if you could interact with the word worldview.
Hmm.
Um, in the last few years in the world of apologetics, there's been a little bit of pushback against worldview thinking. And
Yeah.
is that even a thing? I don't know how you would feel about that, Clark. But
Yeah.
what is worldview? Why is worldview or worldview thinking important? Um, is it important? Are there alternative ways to think about apologetics, or does it just kind of depend on how you define worldview? I know I'm asking very vaguely, but basically what I'd like you to do is interact with the word.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's probably two answers to the question, and that may be that there's a great philosophical breakdown of what constitutes a worldview. And those who study philosophy know that that's a very loaded term when we say a worldview, that there's a lot of ways we could define a worldview. For me, simply, I think that it's the ideas that shape your understanding of the world, that shape what you believe in, what you believe as far as our meaning, our purpose, and value here, and maybe what you believe about the afterlife as well. But our meaning, purpose, and value. Why do we exist? It's a big question, and films interact with this a lot. Films give you, so the Matrix film, for an example, is one where someone is trying to wake up to the real world, that we're just in this illusory world. And it goes back to philosophers like Rene Descartes, thought maybe there's some kind of man behind the controls, and this is all some simulation. And so worldview is a big word. So you're right, it's probably one that's hard to define without a long philosophical essay about it. But yeah, simply, if I could define it simply from my perspective, I'd say that it's these ideas that shape our why are we here. Why am I here? What does it mean to be here? What does it mean to exist? And what effect do my choices have? So a film like Groundhog Day, where Bill Murray's living the same day over and over and over again, and he's learning how to live life. He's learning all the mistakes that he's made. He's learning how to be more loving. He's learning a lot of things in life. It's dealing with some worldviews of what does it mean to be a good person. That film is sort of kind of hung up on that because Bill Murray is kind of a jerk in the film at the beginning, and at the end he learns to be more compassionate. And he learns, but these are things that I believe really only hold water, not only if theism is true, but in the Christian faith. I believe that Christ gives us the purpose, meaning, and value that cannot be found elsewhere. And so I think it's important for Christians to dialogue with films.
So, are you the kind of guy who has a top 5 list just off the top of your head?
That's a tough one, man. I've been trying to figure out my top 5 for a long time. So
So
yeah,
if I
that's
give
a
you
tough
a top
one.
100, you'd be able to, but top 5,
Oh yeah, top
top
5 is way harder than top
yeah, it
100 for sure, for sure. I've always loved the Fellowship of the Ring. It's I know that it's not a classic film by any means, but it's a film that out of all the Lord of the Rings films, I'm a huge Tolkien fan, so out of all the films, that one's my favorite, out of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. But I like Alfred Hitchcock. I like some of his stuff, although we don't watch a lot of it in our classes because some of it's a little creepy. But I do like Hitchcock films. And watching some of these classic films over again, I'm seeing the value of some of the classic films. Sunrise is a really powerful film, where it's a silent film, and I'm not a huge silent film buff or anything of that nature, but watching the film again, it just stirs so many emotions. And so I don't know, man, it's really hard to put a top 5 list to it. But I've been watching films all my life, and they've always impacted me. When I
yeah.
was a kid, my favorite film was Space Jam, so that may be one I shouldn't admit on here, but
You
yeah,
should
that
put that in class.
was
I'd love to watch that recorded lecture.
yeah, yeah,
Well, that's cool.
yeah.
So I'm actually curious about. So you're offering 2 classes, and viewers
Mm,
can see below what the 2 classes of this coming fall are: film and apologetics, and then the grammar of poetry. And the grammar of poetry is for the old junior high
mm,
age stratus, right? So grades 7 through 9.
yeah.
So twofold question: why did you choose to teach the grammar of poetry? And then, what's the connection between taking the grammar of poetry in junior high and then film and apologetics in high school? Or is there a connection? Maybe you just are teaching both of these because they're subjects you enjoy.
Yeah, yeah. I will say too, I'm developing a couple other courses as well that I hope to offer on Kepler. But I do have these two now, and so while I'm developing those, I've actually been teaching the grammar of poetry over the spring, and I've really enjoyed teaching the class. It's not a course that I developed; it's a course that was developed by Matt Whitling, and Roman Rhodes published the materials, and it's a great course because it goes back to the fundamental elements of poetry, which you don't have to be a great poet to find the value in the grammar of poetry. And so we've talked about meter and rhyme schemes and similes and metaphors. These are all things that you use in more than just poetry. You can use metaphors and simile and good imagery and any writing. Really, it's sort of a broad thing to be able to master poetry. But I will say, poetry causes you to really reflect on language, and it also is one of the most difficult things to write because you have to pay attention to detail. And if you're not attentive to detail, your poem won't be very effective. And so, as we've been working through the course over the spring, and we've been reviewing some of just the foundational elements of poetry, and we just had a class on meter, and meter is one of those things that's really tough to master. And it's something that you're used to if you listen to music. Dr. Holly Ordway, I was able to study under her at Houston Baptist, and she taught some poetry there and taught us some poetry. And one of the things that she taught us was that poetry is the most widely read literature. And what she meant by that was we all listen to music, we all have songs that we memorize. So even today, poems are found in music. So you got music, and there's a connection between music and film, in that Matt Whitling describes poetry as the language of music and pictures, because poetry is filled with imagery. So again, there's that concept of image making, of the imagination that comes to play in both film and poetry. There's a great connection there between the imaginative appeal or the imaginative apologetic approach to film and to poetry. And of course, a lot of the classic texts, the Odyssey, for example, is just rich, poetry. Or even you go to Shakespeare a lot later on, one of the first playwrights, and now there's films made about Shakespeare and whatnot. But the point being that the language that is used is so detailed, and it's organized, and it's patterned, and it's really really well put together, and it forces you as the writer to have to slow down and really look at what you're writing. And I think it's different than just typical prose writing. So if I'm writing an essay and I'm expounding on an idea, I don't pay near the amount of attention to each word as I do when I'm writing a poem.
Yes.
So you have to really focus in as a poet, and it's just a important discipline that will make any writer a better writer. And so I think anyone can benefit from poetry, whether or not they plan to become a great poet. You can benefit from that as a writer.
Yeah, I'm actually really fond of the grammar of poetry myself. Some of my kids have gone through it as they homeschool. I actually did it myself as well a few years back, and I'm an enthusiast for poetry. And one of the things that I think is cool is all the things that you say about writing are true, but I think it also has the same effect on our speaking life. The study of poetry and the study of the grammar of poetry, right? The using technique to make something beautiful, the same way a painter or a sculptor would. I think even when we speak, it changes how we're conscious of the language in our mouths and can make us more compelling speakers. So yeah, I think it's actually very elegant of you to have the grammar of poetry for junior high and then an apologetics course for high school. Well, we've got film and apologetics. We've got the grammar of poetry. Are you willing to sneak us a preview of the courses you're developing?
Yeah, I have worked on a mass communication and technical or presentation skills course where it's a lot of what I do, which is I speak publicly a lot. So it's training. It's sort of considered a rhetoric course, and so I've been working on that. I took a course very similar to that at HBU with Mary Jo Sharp, where she actually taught apologetics communication. So you're using apologetics to communicate effectively. But even some of the things I've adapted from that course, will help students in the future with technical communication as well, developing a CV or a resume. I mean, these are all things you'll need in the future, but also learning how to present yourself, how to give a proper speech. All these things are important. So I would consider it a rhetoric course, but it's sort of a technical communication course. I've been working on that. I've also been working on just a pure cultural apologetics course, where they focus on the imaginative side of apologetics. So that one's a lot more related to the other three courses I've developed. So it'll be a little more focused on the cultural side, the imaginative side. So we might write some stories, we might write some poetry, but all in an attempt to combine that with making a defense of the faith. And so again, it's apologetics, but not strictly a philosophical sense. And this is primarily what I studied at Houston Baptist, was cultural apologetics. And so I feel like that's where I probably have my best tools are in cultural apologetics.
So right now, for the audience who's viewing, as we approach the end of our stream, it would be wonderful to have questions come in from you guys. Let's put this guy on the spot. He puts himself on the spot. He goes online and he does apologetics.
Yeah.
So he's accustomed to it. So let's try to throw him some doozies. We'd love to have some questions come in in the comments, and then we'll field them. So I do have a question here on poetry. Peter Leithart describes poetry as an excess of speech. I don't know in what context he said that. So, I mean, I would be hesitant to try to interpret what he means by excess of speech. But you should not be hesitant. You should go. What are your thoughts about that?
Oh man. Yeah, I'm not sure. Again, I'd have to have the context of the quote, but
So actually, let me. Daniel Fukushima, who submitted this question, actually put in a
yeah,
couple of follow-ups, which leads to a tighter question that we'll handle more easily. So,
yeah.
access to speech. Brian Cole describes poetry as anything in meter, if he's quoting him right. So then the question is,
Okay,
how do
yeah,
you define
yeah.
poetry? This has a better handle on
I
that.
would agree with Brian Cole as describing it as anything in meter. I would, there would be others that would take me to task on that, I'm sure, but it's very unique to think of poetry as music in a sense too, because when we're reading poetry and we're looking at the meter, we're doing scansion. We're looking at the meter. That's a unique task in itself. So you have blank verse poetry, you have all kinds of different, versions of poetry, and people have their favorites. So people may want, to read a sonnet that's in iambic pentameter, and that's their favorite way to read. But there are others who are more open to blank verse. I'm more fond of sonnets. I like all of Shakespeare stuff. I like knowing exactly what I'm reading and exactly what meter it's in, and but I think again, you're going to get sort of like the worldview question. You're probably going to get a lot of different answers when you try to define poetry. So it's a good question because it makes you think about, what constitutes poetry. Does any song on the radio constitute poetry? Because if that's the case, there's some songs that are just awful, awful that would constitute as
Well,
poetry.
don't argue that bad poetry doesn't exist.
Right, right.
Well, I think that without saying, we don't have to say here that every song is a poem, although
Yeah,
it could be. But I certainly think making the connection to music is,
yeah.
is an important part of how we define poetry. I do like how you were able to give an answer that's engageable, but
Mm.
didn't completely answer the question.
Yeah, yeah.
That was very well played.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do like Matt Whitling's definition of it in grammar of poetry, which again, he says is the language of pictures and music.
Right.
So then you have the pictures involved. It's also describing something that's picturesque. Image making, back to the imagination as well. So I
Yeah.
like Matt Whitling's definition. It's real simple and easy to remember, and it helps me when I run up against that question as well.
So we have a question that has to do with storytelling and film.
Mm.
So Samuel asks, do you think that stories are a good means to do apologetics, like the ones exploring ideas such as the Matrix?
I do. And I think it depends on the context of who you're doing apologetics with, what your goal is with apologetics, who you're writing to, who your audience is. So you know, I would say that stories are a great way to bring meaning out. So not only do we just, I think it was Lewis that said, reason is the organ of truth, imagination is the organ of meaning. So it's not just reason alone per se, but putting it into an applicable sense. Fedor Dostoevsky has A Crime and Punishment, and I think it's a great story which kind of deals with someone's guilty conscience that's playing over and over in his head, and it really shows that evil is more than just some social construct that we've made over time, but it's actually good and evil are very real in a sense. And so again, morality points to our creator as well, but here it is in a story form. What does it mean to do something that's evil, and how does that affect the world? So again, stories in a way just bring to light these arguments. They're really great arguments. I'm not necessarily advocating for stories being the primary vehicle for apologetics. I think there's a proper place for each one. It's my particular favorite, version of apologetics would be cultural apologetics. I enjoy reading stories versus just listening to a debate or a lecture. I do enjoy reading the stories, but I think that's a good question because it depends on who your audience is, who are you trying to reach. But I think just about anyone, stories have an effect on us. I think it's a very universal thing, on a way to do apologetics.
So kind of connecting to some of your answer here, you mentioned that one of your mentors was Philip Talon,
Mm,
and I saw that you actually had him on your podcast, and there was this
yeah,
great YouTube video on horror films actually.
yeah.
And I was fascinated to see one of the titles of the books that Dr. Talon, I believe,
Mhm.
had written, which was "The Poetics of Evil Toward an
Mm,
Aesthetic Theodicy."
yeah.
Uh, so yeah, I wonder if you could unpack a little more what you said about evil in story.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
what you think right now, guys? We are in the part of the live where you can submit your questions, and we'd be happy to interact with them. So please feel free to put in the comments any questions you might have for Mr. Weidner. We're talking about apologetics, film. We've talked about poetry for a bit, so we'd be happy to take your questions. All right, evil.
Yeah. This is a great point because when I had Dr. Talon on the podcast and we are talking about horror films, now we do watch some of the classics in the class that I'm teaching, Nosferatu as an old horror film. So we're not watching some of the things that, are promoted necessarily today that are a little more gruesome but in a sense, Dr. Talon was writing a book on horror films. And so I had him on the podcast to talk about that, kind of his perspective. And, some of the things that we talked about was, in certain films, The Exorcist, for example, which is considered, a very evil film. It's not a film I would necessarily would recommend anybody watch. It's a very, very dark film. But the effect that it had on audiences where people really begin to wonder, is this thing, is this real? Is evil real? Is the demonic real? And if the demonic's real, then, maybe God's real. And so it became sort of a talking point that we really, keyed in on, where if evil exists, well, what does that mean for good? And if goodness exists, then, where does that come from? And what's the source of goodness? And how can we be saved from evil? And how can we be, saved from suffering and from despair? And so again, you have this standard that you begin to measure of what's good and what's evil. And if you have that standard, of course, there has to be, something that sets the bar, that sets the standard for us. And God being the source of true goodness and beauty and all things great, you know, uh, being that standard that we measure these things by. So I think evil has a unique a role to play when we're giving, just strictly from a philosophical standpoint. I think the argument from morality, where we're arguing that if good and evil exists, maybe God exists. You have to have a perfect arbiter of goodness. You have to have this, source of goodness. It becomes a great argument from an apologetic standpoint, where evil actually can prove God's existence. And there's been some good work done on that. I'm not going to try to hash out all the arguments because I will butcher some of the great philosophers that have done it really well. But using evil as a starting point to talk about, what is evil? What does it mean to say something's evil? Is evil something that exists? As in an Augustinian sense, what does evil mean? Just what are we talking about when we say evil? And then from there, what is goodness, and what is the source of goodness, and where do we have hope, or are we here? There's a great film that we're going to watch in our class called Signs, where um, Mel Gibson plays this priest, and his wife was killed in this car crash, and now he believes that everything is just a matter of either chance, coincidence, uh, something aside from there being a God that's watching over us. He no longer believes in God, and by the end of the film, a miracle happens, and his faith is restored. So evil kind of took away his faith. And I think it's one of the most difficult things for apologists to address is the problem of evil. It's probably the most effective argument from the other side of the aisle, if you will, that, the problem of evil, how can a loving God or, an all good God allow suffering? It's a great question. And I think it leads us into these films as well that play this out in a story.
Yeah, and as Christians, actually tackling evil is an important part of theodicy, of apology. Um, it's interesting how when pagans and atheists might come at us with their challenges, such as the problem of evil, they're allowed to ask us
Mm,
why evil, but it
mm,
really seems like and I think it's because it's such a slam dunk that it's like it's unfair.
right.
But we're not really allowed. There's no engagement with the question of on what basis, like what
Yeah.
is evil, even like how can you even say and suffering is so often used as a
Yeah.
substitute for evil. But how can you even say that evil exists?
Yeah.
Right? On what basis? And we're not really allowed to ask that question, but stories can infiltrate that question and infiltrate those considerations, not only with people who might be debating with us, but to people who have just sort of swallowed the general, like, evil is an illusion. We just want to avoid suffering in this life. Most of us in this age accept that, but then storytelling can really shatter it, can make us consider without necessarily us having to go through the sort of trauma that like a Mel Gibson character went through. We can see the story. So when Mel Gibson's character goes through this trauma, and then we examine, or we watch The Exorcist, and we confront the idea of real evil, and whether it exists, why it exists, what good might be, just because of the story.
Yeah, you raised such a great point, because I think if God doesn't exist and evil has just become something that, maybe as an evolutionary byproduct for survival, that we've learned that we call things good or evil, or we don't want to hurt our fellow man, or whatever, then evil just becomes a matter of preference, really. And so it becomes hard to condemn people because for what they've done. So the great famous example that most Christian apologists will throw out is Hitler. Obviously, it's hard to condemn Hitler if his notions of good and evil were just shaped by his environment that he grew up in, and were just byproducts of social Darwinism. And so it becomes harder and harder for us to condemn that. But you see that in these stories, and you watch old war films where good triumphs, or you watch a film where Marvel films where the good guy has to beat the bad guy, and you root for the good guy no matter what. And it really brings this question to the table: as why is he the good guy, and why is this the villain in the story, and why do we want the villain to be triumphed? And so what does it mean to say that evil exists? It's a great question, but it's often at the heart of stories as well.
Well, Mr. Clark Weidner, thank you so much. Film and Apologetics, the Grammar of Poetry, a few other courses might be coming down the line, and don't forget to check out thesolidfaith.com. On a personal level, as everyone's been hearing, I really quite enjoyed the content, and I'm sure that you guys would find it fruitful and helpful for your everyday Christian walk. Clark, thank you so much. I appreciate you being here, and on behalf of Kepler, we're looking forward to this fall, and thanks everybody out there.
Thank you so much, Joffrey. I appreciate it.